At a first glance, Heretic Fork looks like a Vampire Survivor-like or Bullet Heaven game. But when I actually played it though, I think it strongly deviates from those classic, core Bullet Heaven genre elements. And that's also why I actually enjoyed playing through it. So let's get into it. I would consider Heretic Fork to be a simplified tower defense game with some novel card game mechanics that really sold me on the game. The core gameplay of Heretic Fork revolves around you taking on the role of an employee of hell, whose task is defending your core against waves of enemies or sinners rushing towards you. In order to defend that core, you can play cards that have various effects. Some create or upgrade towers that attack enemies, or create garrisons that summon allied units. Most other cards, though, allow you to stack passive buffs, though there are occasionally some active cards and other ability cards as well. This game has 18 different characters or employees you can play as, most of whom introduce unique mechanics along your run. Tower defense-wise, the game's pretty simple. You don't control the targeting for towers or garrisons at all, and the enemies all just rush towards the center. As such, the game doesn't have that tower placement strategy that's core to a lot of tower defense games. But it does still have that feeling of you placing buildings or towers and watching them do their own thing, attack on their own. This core, very simple, very basic combat gives the game that superficial, survivor-like Bullet Heaven feel. Because the tower defense elements are so streamlined, the bulk of the gameplay comes in the form of card mechanics. After you kill a certain number of enemies, you have a playing card turn where the game pauses. In general, you draw 4 cards each turn and have 6 energy points you can use to play cards. And that usually results in you playing 1 to 3 cards per turn, most often 2. The structures that you play from cards can take on the form of towers, which directly attack enemies in some capacity, and garrisons, which spawn units that seek out enemies and fight them. There are also 3 different damage types that structures can have: Holy, Unholy, and Hellfire. Enemies don't have any particular weakness in any of these damage types, so it mostly allows for different flavor, different build interactions, things like that. Each structure can only be buffed by playing certain upgraded cards. At the most basic level, playing garrison buffing cards buff garrisons, and not towers. Holy damage buffing cards buff holy structures, and not the other 2. More than that though, different towers will not all be upgraded by each different tower upgrade. For example, some towers can't be buffed by the cards that increase tower AoE because those towers don't have AoE projectiles. Other towers can't be affected by attack speed buffs because they just aren't. Because of that, it's important to always check which cards actually buff the towers that you're running to make sure you aren't wasting your hand, wasting energy, things like that. Additionally, because each structure can only be buffed by certain cards, it makes focusing on one specific damage and structure type combo usually the best strategy for a certain run. For example, one run might focus on Unholy damage tower specifically, because now both Unholy buffing cards and tower buffing cards can increase the attack power, the damage of your towers. As you play more and unlock more cards, as we'll talk about later, you can discover more combos that make more structure variety within a run possible. But for the most part, I had the most success when I'm more narrowly focused on one category of structures and damage type. At a minimum, even if you don't do a double combo, both structure type and damage type, having some focus like only Unholy damage or only garrisons is basically required to have a successful build. There are definitely some unbalanced qualities in regards to which builds feel more fleshed out and more viable. For one, the Unholy damage type, especially Unholy towers, felt a lot more fleshed out. Unholy damage has a crit chance mechanic, it has a tower that combos with crits, and it has a tower that applies a debuff mechanic that combos nicely with mini cards. In contrast, Holy and Hellfire damage almost have no unique mechanics outside of maybe 1 or 2 cards. Further, Hellfire also has fewer available structures to choose from at the start of each run, with only 1 Hellfire garrison that can be used to start runs. It kind of feels like they added extra mechanics to make Unholy feel more unique, and then just ran out of time and never added that same quality, those same mechanics, to the other 2 damage types. I also think there's a similar but smaller imbalance between towers and garrisons. Towers and garrisons do have a similar amount of upgrade cards that affect both structures, and there are also some builds that require a combo of towers and garrisons on the same run. However, there are also 2 to 3 times as many towers as there are garrisons, and that just makes it feel like you can do a lot more with them because of that. Some of these towers also have unique attack mechanics, like that tower that attacks faster as you do Unholy crits, and that can lead to just some more creative builds than you see with garrisons. Again, there's just a little asymmetry between the 2 structure types. Now let's talk about the card game mechanics. Every turn, cards can be played, upgraded, or banished from your deck. Cards are split into 5 different tiers of cards. One of the core mechanics in this game, and also the most unique mechanic to Heretic Fork, is the ability to combine cards of the same tier in order to create cards of higher tiers. For example, you can combine 2 tier 3 or blue cards in exchange for a more powerful tier 4 or purple card. Higher tier cards can have stronger effects of lower tier cards. For example, there are 3 tiers of cards that can increase your holy damage, 10%, 20%, and 30% respectively. Other times, these higher tier cards have unique effects, like a tier 5 card that gives a large damage buff if you have all 3 damage types at once. I honestly can't think of a game that has a mechanic that feels quite like this. This mechanic of comboing cards to upgrade them each turn creates a lot of interesting choices and trade-offs. And it's the main reason that I enjoyed this game so much and played it as much as I did. Oftentimes, the choice to upgrade cards is obvious, because higher tier cards are often better, and oftentimes those lower tier cards that you have in your hand don't fit your build anyways. But other times, it might be better to play lower tier cards in order to get some buff stacking up and use up all of your energy wisely. For example, it's better in the short term to play 2 20% holy damage cards than combine them for 1 card that gives 30% holy damage. Your deck also has a minimum size of 13 cards. So as you combine cards in a way that lowers your deck size, your deck also fills up with rocks, which are rubbish tier 1 cards with very minor buffs associated with them. You can add other higher tier cards to your deck as well at various points. So if your deck is large enough, fusing cards together doesn't always add rocks to your deck. All of these mechanics create a game where you're constantly turning over your deck as the run goes on. During some turns, you'll be able to add useful cards to your deck that you keep long term, but oftentimes, these cards leave your deck, usually through upgrades, not that long after they come in. In some ways, this turnover makes the game more of a deck builder than a standard card game roguelite, because you're constantly making a choice around upgrading cards or not in a way that will change your deck and flesh it out. In that sense, you're constantly modifying your deck, constantly deck building. In other ways, these same mechanics made Heretic Fork feel like less of a deck builder than other card game roguelites, because it never feels like you're creating a nice, cohesive deck. Sure, I would often keep a couple cards that were just very powerful upgrades that I would use every single time I drew them, but 90% of the time, my cards would, sooner or later, get merged and destroyed to create more powerful cards. Unlike a game like Slay the Spire, you would never look at your deck at the end of a Heretic Fork run and reflect on your build, because most of the cards you played won't be in that final deck. The final build-defining element in Heretic Fork comes in the form of what employee or character you're using. There are 8 main employees in this game, most of which have some unique mechanic. For example, one employee has a mechanic where you can gamble cards to upgrade them, play them at no cost, delete them, and a couple other small actions. Another employee has a mechanic that buffs his damage as you play rock cards, those tier 1 trash cards that I mentioned earlier. All these different employees led to different builds and different play styles, with some of them, like the rock hero, leading to an incredibly different prioritization than you might otherwise have, like keeping rock cards in order to play them as opposed to upgrading them or banishing them away. Each of these employees also have different variants. For the most part, these variants just add some different starter stats, some different flavor. For example, one variant makes you start with increased hellfire damage at the cost of decreased holy and unholy damage. Other variants, though, actually do add new mechanics, like one variant that adds new festive trees that deal AoE damage to enemies. I quite like this variety, and all the different playstyles add a lot more playtime to the game for me. Some of them definitely do feel a lot stronger and more viable than others, though. It is worth noting that all characters start with more or less the same starter deck, with some small variation for certain employee variants or what structures you choose at the start. I do also want to talk about the overall controls and UI of the game for a second. It definitely feels a little unpolished, with a couple strange quirks here and there. Some information was hard for me to find at first, and other mechanics led to some frustration for me. For example, the button for merging 2 cards together for an upgraded card and the button for banishing a card, aka removing it from your deck, are in the same place. If you can merge 2 cards together, it's the merge button, and otherwise, it's the banish button. This made it a lot easier for me to brain dead click banish out of habit if I accidentally mismatched cards into the merging section, things like that. Additionally, there's a list of all the passive upgrade type cards that you played for a given run, but it's in the same spot on the screen as the card merger. So there are times when you have to merge cards together, but you can't see what those passive upgrades are that you played. This is important because there are times where, depending on your past upgrades that you played, you might want to pick a certain card over another. There's some cards and buffs that can't be double played, so if you've already played one, you don't want to pick it again, things like that. And there are a couple other small annoyances as well, like some of the card animations lingering a couple seconds longer than they should, and there's no option around animation speeds. None of these UI blemishes or other small qualities ruin the game for me, but they did impact that overall experience and made it feel less polished. To their credit though, there is an important game speed option for the tower defense elements, for the combat, and that's amazing because the game feels a lot better when you play it on faster speeds. Finally, I did try this game on my Steam Deck, and I definitely would not recommend doing that. There's no native controller support in this game, so instead you have to use the touchscreen or the trackpad as a mouse. However, playing with the touchscreen is actually also not viable because I haven't figured out a way to move the cards from your hand into the merging and upgrading section, which is obviously a core mechanic, and that makes it basically impossible to play. Outside of that, the text on the cards and many other gameplay elements are too small to really read and appreciate. The text just doesn't display properly on that low resolution, so it's just not legible, even if you held the screen closer. So yeah, it does run on the Steam Deck, but I wouldn't recommend playing it on it. Now let's talk about variety and randomness in Heretic Fork. RNG plays a pretty big role in this game, in a large part because of how that card upgrading system actually works. You're constantly upgrading cards and choosing new cards out of a set of small options. RNG here is kind of funny because, on the one hand, it can be incredibly impactful to get the right cards. For example, getting a good tier 4 damage buffing card you can stack early on that fits your build can be incredibly powerful. Along with that, if you can't get those unholy damage buffing cards for your unholy damage build, it's going to hurt you a lot. But if you're focusing on both one damage type and one structure type, like both unholy and towers for example, there are so many different upgrade cards that will help you that can be rolled. You won't always get that one that you want. You won't always get the most beneficial one for a certain moment. But you can always get cards that you can work with. Along with that, the fact that you're constantly merging and upgrading cards means that useless cards can be repurposed as upgrade fodder if you don't want to play them. So there is a baked-in counter RNG measure that doubles as a strategy element. You can merge those cards if you don't want them and get better cards as a result. Still, some builds are a lot more RNG reliant or dependent than others. It's a lot easier to get a strong Unholy Tower build than it is to get a Hellfire Garrison build. There's a lot more Unholy Tower options than there are Hellfire Garrison options. As a result, those structure cards will pop up just a lot more often. You have more proverbial rolls of the dice to get those cards, get those upgrades, things like that. But while this RNG affects the gameplay specifics, it affects your build. My overall build type was decided at the start of most runs, and this is due to how you choose 2 starting structures for each run, along with your employee choice. Narrowing your build focus down pretty early on, at least to some basic degree, is pretty important because it allows you to start stacking buffs that'll last the rest of the game. If you change structure type or damage type halfway through, most of your past upgrades will be useless and won't carry over. As a result, if I picked 2 Unholy Towers at the start of my run, it would be an Unholy Tower run 95% of the time, unless I got a really strong different structure type very early on. Similarly, employee type would often decide other build factors from the start. If you pick that rocked character, for example, you would have to run a rock-focused build, and if you start with the merchant employee, you should probably run a cash and gold-focused build to synergize with that core gold mechanic. So if you want true run-to-run variety, you have to pick different build types at the start of each run. If you have the same starting towers, the same employee, the same variant run to run, your runs will start to feel very similar, despite that with in-run RNG around build specifics. The RNG more impacts what you can focus on within a certain category, like unholy crit build versus tower buffs versus active abilities, as opposed to you starting with unholy towers and instead ending your run with Hellfire Garrisons. It's also worth touching on the enemy variety as well. This game has a pretty decent amount of enemy variety, though a large amount of it is just aesthetic differences. Some enemies do have different movement speeds or mechanics like spawning allies, things like that. This does force you to have some more rounded structure types at times, mostly balancing AoE and single target damage. The waves also spawn in different patterns that has some nice visual variety, and that's also an additional factor that makes you have to balance out your build a little bit, be able to deal with different types of enemies and how they come. So overall, the variety in this game is decent, but it's definitely not on the level of the roguelike greats. There are a good amount of structures to try, a good amount of employee variants to try, and a decent amount of builds. But there aren't that many broad build types, and the variety feels held back by weird imbalances and how fleshed out certain damage types and structure types feel. Now let's talk about progression and replayability in Heretic Fork. The core progression system is a mix of currency-based and achievement-based unlock systems that have a mix of vertical and horizontal progression. Completing specific achievements allows you to unlock additional cards for future runs. Some of these achievements can be unlocked unintentionally or passively, but other achievements require more deliberate focus and actively seeking them out and doing them. Achievements often unlock cards related to their unlock conditions. For example, there's a card that gives you increased holy damage, like 10% at the lowest tier. If you pass a certain holy damage increase percentage on a given run, you can unlock the 20% holy damage card, and then the 30%, and things like that. This acts as a sort of indirect vertical progression system, where you unlock more powerful cards that can be used on future runs. This also creates a system where, in order to have the best cards for certain builds, you have to already have had good runs with that build type. In order to have the best holy damage builds, you have to have some good holy damage runs that unlock the better holy damage cards. In addition to those achievements, you can also unlock cards with cash that you get after each run. I couldn't see any logic to the order these cards unlock, so I suspect that it's randomized, but I'm also not really sure. I actually didn't see this card unlocking system until I'd already played for over 10 hours, so I definitely ruined my own progression pacing in that way. And this card system is where the bulk of the card unlocks come from, including new tower types and miscellaneous higher tier cards. The same cash system is also used for unlocking different employee types and their different playstyles. So altogether, these systems allowed unlocking new builds and new playstyles. I do like the achievement unlock system in general, but it does feel like a bit of a win more system that made me want to double down on a certain strategy after I'd unlocked those better cards for it, as opposed to trying a new one where I had to start from zero. As a whole, my progression pacing for this game felt kind of terrible and slow. But that's also because, as I said, I didn't notice that core unlock mechanic for so long. If I had, I think the progression would have been mostly fine. It's still one of those games where you feel like your starting pool of possible cards is hurting your ability to win until you get some core unlocks under your belt. You do also unlock a ton of cards, and that does dilute the card pool. As I unlocked more cards, I felt my ability to get specific builds really diminished because instead of trying to get 4 cards out of 50 possible cards, for example, I was trying to get 5 cards out of 200 cards. For the most part, this card pool dilution felt balanced out by the number of new fun combos and viable cards. But it also made the RNG worse for certain things. I do wonder if this game would have benefited from some sort of deck sorting or way of prioritizing cards, but it's hard to say exactly how that would have worked and how that would have been fun. Finally, you can unlock an endless mode in different difficulty settings as well. There are 5 different difficulty levels to climb. They each add a specific challenge, though they're mostly just stat buffs to enemies, like Torment 1, adding more health to all enemies. These also increase your cash gain, so it can speed up that progression as well. The Endless Game Mode is a separate game mode that you select from the start. However, achievements and unlocks are disabled in this mode, which I thought was a really weird choice. I already don't enjoy Endless Game Modes that much, and feeling locked out of the progression at the same time felt like a double blow. Because of that, I actually never played this game mode. I do want to talk about some mild spoilers here as well regarding how you unlock these difficulty levels, so skip ahead to the next section if you don't want even those mild spoilers. This mechanic is hinted at from the start of the game, but spoiler warning anyways. I actually didn't think this game had difficulty levels for a really long time. In most roguelites, beating a run at the base difficulty mode will unlock difficulty levels for you to climb. In Heretic Fork, getting 1 win unlocks the endless mode. In order to get difficulty levels, you have to beat the game with 6 different employees out of 7 possible ones. This unlocks the 8th and final employee you can play as, along with those difficulty levels. I really did not like this unlock system. I felt that you got difficulties way too late, and at that point, the game feels pretty trivial to win. The game does clearly hint at this goal by having a lock that requires 6 keys and having you earn a key by winning with a new employee. But I assume this mechanic just unlocked the final employee and not also difficulty levels. I eventually looked up online and double checked this game did have difficulty levels because it felt so confusing for me that it didn't have them. I really needed those difficulty levels to climb because it got kind of boring to win every single run once you figured out the core mechanics, had those core unlocks. but it wasn't until my 8th or 9th win that I actually unlocked them, so I didn't realize what I had to do at first. So yeah, it's not the end of the world, but I would have 100% quit playing this game hours earlier if I hadn't checked online and saw that yes, it does have difficulty levels, I just haven't unlocked them yet. Heretic Fork has a unique setting and storytelling methods. In Heretic Fork, you're an employee at a company in hell that's trying to prevent sinners from escaping. You can play as many different past employees in the gameplay itself. Outside of the gameplay, the menu and other gameplay qualities take on the appearance of using a desktop on a computer. I think it's a fun theme for a game and a nice metagame of sorts. There's a lot of funny elements, like various fake corporate emails about this hell company and the various demons. There's also some miscellaneous collections and some small quirks, like getting a little demon that runs across your desktop. I also really enjoyed the ending sequence for this game that involved unlocking the final character and how that fit into the overall theme. That said, I think the developers took it a little too far at times in a way that was annoying. There is this Clippy clone in the game that gives you pop-ups for all of that metagame, desktop elements, and sometimes this helped with the humor and added to the game. But it also gave so many pop-ups every time a run ended. After basically every single run, you would get an email. And Clippy would give me multiple notifications that I had to click through, as well as notification on the email app itself. I eventually found out you can turn Clippy off, which I went back and forth on because I like the fun meta elements that Clippy did, but I hated that double, triple notifications that I got for simple story filler elements. So as a whole, this unique theme and story elements were nice. I like the desktop menu, I like the mini games, but they also took it a little far at times in a way that was very mildly annoying. It's also worth mentioning, this game heavily leans into heavy metal music. They actually have some established metal artists that put their music into the game as part of the soundtrack. I can't play those here for copyright reasons, but one of these bands is Disturbed. And on that note, let's talk about the game's DLC. Heretic Fork has 4 DLC packages. 2 of these are standard soundtrack packages, with the third being a standard art package. However, the latest DLC, called Inside the Fire, adds 7 new employee variants, as well as a couple songs by Disturbed into the soundtrack. I tried out all these different employee variants, and I really liked a couple of them. One of them adds entirely new card playing mechanic, where playing cards increasing rarity or tier allows you to play more cards in a turn, but it comes at the cost at a lower base energy, meaning that if you can't combo it right, you can only play fewer cards in a given turn. This is my favorite variant out of all of them, and I felt the most impactful in terms of gameplay variety. A couple of the other ones also added some nice smaller twists. For example, one of the employees sacrifice health each turn in order to draw an extra card and gain more energy. And the DLC variant makes it so that you deal increasing damage at lower health at the cost of a lower base damage. Finally, there were a couple DLC variants that felt like complete duds, like the Monkey DLC hero that I couldn't even figure out how it was supposed to work. As a whole, for $3, I think it's a good pickup. I had enough new fun runs from these new variants that for me, it was worth it. I have a couple caveats though. First, it's not a DLC that you need to buy when you first buy the game. It doesn't change any core mechanics, but rather it just adds some more playstyle variety when you want it. Additionally, outside of this DLC, there's a number of free employee variants as well you can try, and a lot of these are crossovers from other games, like Despot's game and Postal 2. But I will say that most of these DLC variants feel a lot more impactful and unique than those free ones. So I'd recommend buying the base game first, see if you actually enjoy playing it, and then consider buying that Inside the Fire DLC if you enjoy playing around with different employee variants, as opposed to running the same employee each run. So what's my verdict on Heretic Fork? Overall, I think Heretic Fork is a decent game, but it just doesn't have that staying power of the great roguelites. I had some fun with Heretic Fork for a while, and it's nice as a turn your brain off second monitor type game. I really love the unique card upgrading mechanic that existed. That said, the game suffers from a lot of problems here and there that don't ruin the core experience, but did make me put it down eventually. This ranged from a lack of polish, unbalanced builds, simple core gameplay, delayed difficulty unlocks, and many other small things here and there. Because of that, I would softly recommend Heretic Fork. It's worth grabbing on sale or for a nice small diversion. I just wouldn't play this game with super high expectations for it to be something that it's not. Huge shout out to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.